Hey everybody, in today's video we are going to talk about freeze dryers and cover as much information as I possibly can on the topic of purchasing a freeze dryer. And this video has actually been a long time coming because I have not been able to find any videos out there that are not through somebody who has an affiliate link or the freeze dryer manufacturers themselves. So I thought, let's make one. We're going to talk about the suggested benefits, the drawbacks, alternatives to freeze drying, and take a really good critical look at what it takes to purchase a machine like this, and whether it's something that we should do. I do plan on making more videos like this one where we take a really good look at something that you might be considering buying and figuring out what the right questions are to ask and things like that. So if you like the way that this video flows, I would really love for you to subscribe so we can have really good conversations about being an informed consumer. And because a lot of my videos are in the food preservation sort of realm, I thought that doing this video on a freeze dryer would be a great first video to do. So before we get into the main part of the video and we start looking at all the details, I do want to say that there are a lot of opinions in this video that are my own, ones that I have drawn by doing a lot of research, looking at the manufacturing websites, watching lots of videos, looking through extension service websites and things like that. If you are considering purchasing a freeze dryer, I hope that you would definitely do your own research. However, I really hope that this video could be a part of that. The perspective that you'll get from this video is definitely a critical one. When things tend to gain a lot of popularity, that to me sends off signals that I need to really take a good long look at something and not just sort of blindly jump on the bandwagon. I have notes because I want to make sure that the important things that I've been thinking about over quite a long period of time are things that we can talk about. Now, this video is not just for people who are thinking about getting a freeze dryer or just like to be a part of the conversation about a purchase like this, but also people who own freeze dryers. I really have a lot of questions because I don't own one myself. And I have definitely been swept up at times in this idea of wanting to buy one or put it on my list, thinking I'd rather have one sooner than later. But I have, I still just have a lot of questions. So throughout this video, there will be periods of time where I'll stop and I'll ask specifically you, if you own one, random questions. So please engage in the comments because that's a really great way to have great conversations about topics like this. Now, freeze dryers, if you don't know what they are, just a super quick overview. It is a way of preserving food where the moisture content is extremely low, and machines are able to accomplish this by first freezing the food and then drying them, similar to the process of dehydrating. It just sucks the moisture out and by drying it after it's frozen. It's pretty self-explanatory in the name itself, but that's the basic process. It's a pretty straightforward process itself. And freeze drying machines have only been available for the general public to purchase for about 10 years, and about 2013 I think is when they started to become available. So it's a relatively new product to the market, and therefore there's just a lot to talk about. So let's get into it. Now, when I talk about the benefits of freeze drying, I'm going to often use the term proposed benefits or suggested benefits because these are only benefits that have been suggested by freeze drying manufacturers, people who own the machines, again with like affiliate links and things like that, or just the idea that this could potentially be a benefit. Again, I don't own one, so I can't actually say I find this to be a true benefit. So the first proposed benefit we will talk about with freeze dryers is food preservation. Now, this is the primary purpose for a freeze dryer, is to preserve food. And really this has to be the most practical purpose for purchasing such a large machine for home use. Now, as with all other types of ways of preserving food, freeze drying is a great way to have long-term food storage, emergency preparedness, and it can also be an element in a working pantry or a pantry that's continuing to turn over its food inventory. Now, when it comes to freeze-dried food versus other methods of preparation or other methods of preserving, there are a number of different things that make it unique. Now I'm going to go through my list here because there's quite a few here. So freeze-dried food retains its color and shape better than dehydrated food. For some people, maybe that's important. For other people, maybe that's actually not that important, but that is something that it does. This method of food preservation also has the least amount of moisture. And when you're talking about preserving food, moisture is sort of the enemy and is what makes the food quality go down or spoilage happen in some way or another over time. Without moisture, the microbes and enzymes that break down food really can't do anything. Freeze-dried food is relatively lightweight and takes up a pretty small amount of space. It's very similar to dehydrated food in that way. And so it's really easy to take it places. It's very portable. There's also claims about the nutritional value of freeze-dried food being far superior to other methods like canning and freezing, just straight up freezing and things like that. I think it would be on par with freezing at the point of preservation. However, you have to keep in mind that food quality degrades, well, not all food quality, but the types of things that they measure degrades when things are canned. So if tomatoes are being canned in a water bath canner and they're sitting in there for 90 minutes or however long it is, that is reducing the nutritional value of the food to an extent. Now, with freeze drying, the actual process, because you're just freezing it and then basically dehydrating it, that is not cooking it. Now, what I think about is, okay, so you have this dehydrated food that has, it's similar to fresh food in terms of nutritional content, but usually that food would then be cooked in some way. Not all of it. If it was fruit and things for, I guess, snacking and things like that, you wouldn't necessarily cook it. But a lot of vegetables, meats, certainly eggs or dairy products, you would be cooking likely in some way after they were already freeze-dried when it came to the point where you were going to use it, in which case those vitamins and nutrients are still going to be subject to heat and nutrient degradation. Degradation, is that the right word? Degrading the nutritional value of the food. So when they say that nutrition is optimally preserved, that has to be taken into consideration, that food is probably not going to be eaten just raw. Another benefit that has been listed is that it is an alternative to pressure canning low acid foods, and that is true. Low acid foods in our country, it is advised to be pressure canning all of that. Not everybody does, and there are certainly other ways to do it. I think that that's not the only way. There's also a suggested benefit that it is the only way to preserve odd things like dairy and eggs. And just like low acid foods, there are other ways to do that. Dehydrating, pickling, fermenting, those are not mentioned. But I think in terms of like a process, so canning, or I think it was mainly comparing it to canning, where yes, that would be an alternative to pressure canning, but it doesn't mean that those foods, there's still not a lot of other options to preserve those types of foods. And then the other thing was rehydration. It says can be rehydrated more fully than dehydrated food, and that is true as well. If you were to take to an extent, if you were making a soup and you were using dehydrated food in a soup, I think that it would go over very well. So there's that to think about as well. Okay, so that is basically the food preservation piece. Now, the next suggested benefit of freeze dryers in general is a low cost of food preservation. So let's take a look at that for a minute. This one perplexes me, that somehow the freeze-dried food being a low-cost method of food preservation has become a benefit of purchasing we'll get into the cost, but a very expensive machine. The thing that we need to keep in mind as consumers is that when they say freeze-dried food will be low cost, preserved in a freeze dryer, they're not talking about the startup cost. They're not talking about ongoing costs, things that we'll talk about in a little bit. They are comparing freeze-dried food sitting on a shelf in a store. And those foods can be marked up as much, I think, as 80 or 85%. It's extremely highly marked up food. maybe to be offsetting the cost of these expensive machines. I don't really know, but freeze-dried food purchased in stores is extremely expensive. So when you compare it to home freeze-dried food, yes, home freeze-dried food coming out packaged would be a lot less, but that's not the only cost. That is not the only thing to consider. The next suggested benefit for purchasing a freeze dryer and having one of these machines in your home is the ease of preparing the food. So when you are, and I think that this is probably to an extent true. So when you are preparing tomatoes to can, I'll go back to the tomato canning one, there's a lot of steps involved, especially if you're going to take those skins off, depending on what you might be doing with those tomatoes. There's a lot of steps. Now, it also, canning would give you a lot more versatility because you could do a lot of different things with those tomatoes specifically that are going to be sitting in those jars. Whether you're seasoning them, you wanting to leave them whole, crushed, diced, whatever it might be, make a sauce, that is something that is incredibly versatile in those jars. Now, when it comes to the ease of preparing something to go in a freeze dryer, all you really need to do is put it on these trays that come with the freeze dryer and put them in the machine. You could prepare them similar to how you would if you were going to freeze. So some may involve blanching or parboiling the food, but other than that, it's just going to go straight into the freeze dryer and the machine pretty much does it. So the next proposed benefit of buying a freeze dryer is that it helps with emergency preparedness. And technically that would be true. You can preserve food in your home using a freeze dryer and add it to your emergency prepared stockpile of food. Now the next benefit that is suggested, now this comes directly from the freeze dry manufacturing website, is making pet food. Now I have made pet food before for our dog. It is not an easy process, so maybe a freeze dryer would make it easier. Our dishwasher just finished. So maybe it would be easier with the freeze dryer. However, pet nutrition is not something that I think we should do without some careful consideration. Talking to a vet or a pet nutrition sort of specialist or somebody who studied it, it should definitely be something that's done carefully and mindfully. But it can benefit some dogs. We have a very large dog, and I think that he has some unique needs, and I think that all breeds maybe have unique needs, and that might be able to help tailor a diet. Okay, now the last benefit that has been suggested by a lot of people, more people than I can count, on reasons to buy a freeze dryer, is that it reduces food waste. Now, if you own a freeze dryer, I have some really big questions on this. Number one, have you used your freeze dryer to freeze dry leftover food? Number two, have you eaten those leftovers? Number three, have you enjoyed them? Number four, would you do it again if you've done it? Or do you do that on an ongoing basis? Those are some really big questions that I have regarding the idea of using a freeze dryer to reduce food waste. I think that there are so many ways to reduce food waste. And so when you have gone through and prepared your dinner, it is the most expensive that food can possibly be, considering it has gone from seed all the way to your plate, hot on your plate, or cold, whatever it is. And so why would you then put it through a freeze dryer machine to make it even more expensive at that point? I do understand the idea of trying to avoid waste, but I think that maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I think that the number one thing that we can do to avoid food waste is to probably just reduce the amount of food that we bring into our house and prepare. So that's what I have for benefits. And truly, I feel like these are only benefits if you view them in a certain way. So let's get into the drawbacks. Drawbacks of buying a freeze dryer. Number one, we're going to talk about cost. And cost will be broken out into two different groups. It's going to be the initial cost and then ongoing cost. The initial cost of freeze dryers. Now, I have noticed the pricing on freeze dryers ranging from about $2,500 to $5,600. That is variable a little bit depending on the size of the machine. There's like a small, medium, large sort of spectrum for home use machines for food use. And then color makes a difference too. There's some that are stainless steel that are more expensive than ones that are white or black. Also, these machines come with pumps, and if you want pumps that are lower maintenance, those are more expensive. So that would be in addition to that initial price tag. Okay, and so the other thing to think about with the initial cost is that, so when you're freeze drying, we talked about how you can put food right on these trays, they go in this freeze dryer, and the machine takes care of it. So I have seen people suggest that they would like to have more trays for the freeze dryer. So that would be an additional cost. And the reason for additional trays in a freeze dryer would be that it can bypass the initial freeze that a freeze dryer can do. If your food is already frozen, you can bypass that step and then just go straight into the drying process. That does reduce the amount of time that the machine is running. And so if you already have freezers, you can pre-freeze your food depending on what that food is and save some time, but that would require you to buy extra trays. And then some of these freeze dryers come with, I guess, sort of a starter set where they have food storage bags and maybe some maintenance items for the pumps and things like that, just basic things. Okay, so ongoing costs. Now these, again, I don't own a machine, so I'm not sure like on the super intricate details, but basically I'm thinking it's going to involve electricity, that's obvious, packaging, and then oil. There are, like I said, there is a pump that's oil free. So if you're paying more, you don't have to worry about that as an ongoing cost, which honestly, if a person was buying a freeze dryer, that would seem like a better step. Because when I was doing some research at one point, I was just kind of looking at the various things on the website and the oil was out of stock. So does that mean you can go anywhere and buy this oil? Or do you have to wait to use your machine until this specific oil is back available to you? When it comes to storing food, you could technically store freeze-dried food in any container like a jar or a bucket or things like that. The suggested way to preserve freeze-dried food is using Mylar bags. And the reason for that is, you know, when they say freeze-dried food can last, you know, such and such a year length of time, that is considered, assuming it's been in the ideal storage environment, which includes Mylar bag because that keeps light as well as air / moisture out. And just like moisture, light is also damaging to food. And so they want to make sure that if you are going to be storing it and you want it to be for long-term use, you need to keep it in an environment that also keeps light out. So these are single-use packages from what I understand. I don't think you can reuse them. If that's incorrect, just let me know because I would like to know if that's incorrect. And so you need to get these Mylar bags, a bag sealer, which sometimes can come with a startup kit depending on the company, and then oxygen absorbers. So again, more ongoing cost. Once those oxygen absorbers are used, they are thrown away. So, you know, the single-use aspect to the packaging is something to consider if that's something that you're mindful about. And then also availability of these things. And of course, if you couldn't get them, you could always use something else. But just know that that is why freeze-dried food is often in Mylar bags. Now, that also means that you would need to think about what to put the bags in, because you couldn't just stack it on a shelf like you could a jar. You would need to then put it in another container. I've seen people throw them in buckets. I would imagine you could also get big storage totes. The other thing on Mylar bags to consider is they would not be rodent proof. So rodents could easily penetrate a bag. Okay, freeze dryers are big machines. They take up a ton of space. So let's talk about the space, installation, just, you know, where it is, size and weight. Freeze dryers cannot be stored just straight on the ground because of the pump mechanism, and I think the draining afterwards, it needs to be off the ground. And so this would probably need to be on a table of some kind. One thing that I've seen people do that seems like a great solution to this is keeping it on a type of rolling cart. This would allow you to store it in a different room and bring it to wherever you needed it when you were going to preserve the food, if that was, you know, closer to your kitchen where you're getting things ready or however that played out. that would be a really easy way to move it around. I don't think that moving this machine manually is very practical for a lot of people. So that seems like a good solution for that problem. The smaller machines are about 60 pounds. The larger machines are even bigger. I think I have it written down here. Just under 140 pounds. Now, even though the smaller machine is 60 pounds, which is a lot less than 140, it's still going to be a very bulky, big size that I would imagine would take at least 2 people to sort of maneuver around. And the pumps apparently are an additional 30 pounds of weight. Now, the other thing to think about is if you didn't have a rolling cart and didn't want to buy one, the environment that a freeze dryer needs to be used is, the temperature is 45 to 80 degrees. I've seen it 45 to 75, but I've also seen 45 to 80. So it would need to be in a place, if it was not going to be moving, that was relatively stable in terms of that temperature window. So these are just all things to consider. I think size is a factor. If you did have a rolling cart, you would need to make sure that wherever it was stored was sort of on the same level that you would use it on, and that could be problematic for us. Here in this house, we just simply don't have the space. I think this thing would need to go into our basement. There's no other place where it would be within that temperature range that it could be out all the time, and I'm not even sure it would fit down our basement stairs. We have an old house, and it's like 25 inches wide or something like that, so it's not even standard washing machine width. So that can be an issue. The other drawback is preservation time. Now, yes, it is a lot more labor intensive to be preserving with canning and things like that, but once the preservation is done, or once you get to the actual time of preservation, it's relatively short. Preserving time can be a really big, I would imagine, can be a really big issue with this. If you freeze dry food, this is some more questions that I have for you specifically. Have you run into issues where you want to preserve more food but don't have the ability to? And this could be solved by buying a larger machine, in which case, the cost is going to be going way up. It would take more electricity to run and things like that. But I'm really curious about that. The running time can vary from 20 to 40 hours. Fresh pineapple can take 48 to 52 hours. If you wanted to freeze dry a bushel of peaches, which is about 48 pounds, when you consider the actual processing time and then the melting time, so the machine can be ready for use again, it would take you over a week to freeze dry a bushel of peaches. And that's a long time. You would definitely need to prepare those peaches in advance and get them in the freezer, because peaches, when they're ripe and needing to be processed, will not wait that length of time. Okay, another thing to think about is the noise. These machines apparently make between 62 and 67 decibels of noise when they're operating, and a standard vacuum cleaner is around 70. So it is not a quiet machine. So if you're having it in your living space, that could be problematic. These machines running for over a day, or a day or more at a time, that's going to interfere with sleep, potentially interfering with your sleep quality, or just be kind of like a nuisance around your house when you're trying to do stuff. Now, the last drawback I'll talk about, which sort of wraps it all in, and is something that I just feel like it's kind of an obvious one, is the environmental impact of buying a big machine like this. I think that yes, freeze-dried food from other companies are more expensive, but I feel like for me personally, where I'm at right now, if those big machines are cranking out freeze-dried food for a lot of people, there's only one of those machines, or however many. But once we all start bringing them into our homes, like washer and dryer and all these other appliances, they just become another big thing. What happens when they break down? Are they easy to fix? How long do they last? These are questions that I don't have answers to. If you do, I would love to hear them. All right. Now, the suggested benefits and the suggested drawbacks are over. That's it. That was a lot of talking. So I appreciate, if you're still here, I appreciate you sitting with me. Now, the next piece that I want to talk about, and we're almost done, is alternatives. Now, it's obvious, I think, that alternatives to freeze-drying food is just to not freeze-dry food. I don't buy freeze-dried food ever, so I don't know that I would necessarily need that. I do see the benefit in having a different way to preserve food, but when it comes with all these other drawbacks, it just makes me very hesitant to think that that's something that I need in my life. I already have a dehydrator, which I love, and I have been doing a ton with it, and I have been just loving it, and I'm so excited for this upcoming year where I can do even more. But dehydrating food is the next closest thing, I guess, in terms of like you're drying a food out to preserve it. But there are lots of other ways to preserve food, including canning, pressure canning, water bath canning, fermenting, pickling, cold food storage. Those to me they're simple, they're basic, some of them are relatively no fuss. But they have their benefits and drawbacks too. But I feel like they're simple and the startup costs are really low, so they're very doable for a lot of people. An alternative to buying a freeze dryer though would be to buy freeze-dried food. You don't just have to go to like a Target and buy freeze-dried food from the snack aisle. You can buy bulk freeze-dried food in number 10 cans or smaller. I feel like there's maybe like the 28-ounce cans too that are sold with a variety of freeze-dried food. So you can get it as an emergency prepared product, specifically geared towards that purchase. They're already in cans that are not Mylar bags that animals can't, get through as easily. Already out of light, oxygen absorbers, the whole thing. So they're already ready to go. They're going to be more, but that might be something to consider. If you were wanting some food assurance in that way, and we're not wanting to get involved and tied up into the whole freeze drying craze. Now, my last two suggestions sort of go hand in hand on alternatives to buying a freeze dryer, and that is to rent or borrow one from somebody who has one, or hire someone to freeze dry stuff for you. It might still be more than if you did it yourself, but it would be a way to sort of machine share and still get the benefits of freeze drying without having to purchase the machine yourself. If you have a freeze dryer, I'm really interested. Have you shared with anybody? Has anybody asked to borrow it? Would you lend it to anybody? I think that a big expensive machine like that, maybe some people would be hesitant to lend it to just anyone, in which case would you consider freeze drying food for someone? These are all questions that I don't have any answers to, but if you have answers, throw them in the comments. So that's the bulk of this conversation. I think number one, if you think of something that I've overlooked, let me know. I try to see all angles. I try to see it, as many details as I can, but I know I miss stuff. And so when it comes to any purchase, big or small, there can be a lot of things to consider, especially something like a freeze dryer. With these machines, I've really gone back and forth. On one hand, they're very innovative. It's amazing that you can have these in your home and create a preserved food like that right in your own home. But when I personally look at the benefits, suggested benefits and drawbacks of these machines, I just don't have it on my list anymore. That might change one day. I don't know for sure, but at least for right now, I'm perfectly fine passing, sticking to the food preservation methods that I use now. So that's really all I have to say. I really want to keep this conversation going in the comments. So if you want to go through and answer some of these questions, if you're considering buying a machine and you have a comment or a question, please throw it in. And I hope to really keep this going. The comments can be some of the most beneficial things, I think, in a video where people can chime in. It's not just one person and one person's perspective, but I like to engage too with you, and I like to answer questions or respond, because even if you're just making a comment and not asking a question or something like that, I like to respond. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you soon.